There's a few things that happen in May 2020 that could affect certain manufacturers, well, and in fact all manufacturers. If you've got a Class 1 reusable device or a Class 3 custom-made device, they don't currently have certification under the MDD. And if you want to continue to sell them in Europe past May 2020, you will need an MDR certificate prior to that date. Otherwise, you will need to remove them from the market until you get MDR certification. So there are some factors that manufacturers need to think about. There are other things that impact, once that date of application has gone. If you've got an MDD certificate, you cannot make changes to the design or the intended purpose of devices listed on that certificate. So does that mean that we can't update those certificates? Can we make changes to them at all? There are some discussions ongoing about what that means and how much change we can make to those MDD certificates. But if you're planning to make a significant design change to a product on an MDD certificate after May 2020, you probably need to be making an MDR application and not changing your MDD certificate. There's lots of factors that are going to affect manufacturers, but it's not just manufacturers that are affected by the MDR. There are other economic operators that are impacted, and manufacturers are going to have to work with their other economic operators to ensure that there's compliance through the whole stream. In theory, the MDR is going to bring better market control, pre-market and post-market. And so there's lots more steps that manufacturers will need to take if they're going to have notified body certification, depending on the type of device that they have. But overall, there is an increased overview of those products. There's a move to include aesthetic devices in the regulations. So the Medical Device Directive and the IVD Directive currently only talk to devices with a medical purpose. The MDR starts to talk about devices that have no medical purpose. So we're talking about contact lenses that are just there to change the color of your eyes, or dermal fillers, or body shaping implants, a range of things that have a no medical purpose. And there's much more specific requirements about them needing to have a quality system in place to ensure that that's done within a controlled environment, because they are effectively placing devices on the market. There's also more detail on the reprocessing of single-use medical devices, and there are details that say that this is permitted by national law only. So if a country does not want to allow reprocessing of devices, they don't have to. So will the UK choose not to apply this? They might choose not to allow reprocessed single-use devices into the country. It depends on the country. But again, there's much more specific details, and it starts to talk about needing a common specification for these types of devices and the requirements. We don't have the common specifications currently, so we will need those before being able to go forward. And it starts to say that those economic operators need to have a quality management system. Historically, those people haven't needed to have a quality management system or a 13485 certificate, but going forward they will do. There's also new requirements for software products, and specifically those that might make decisions with diagnosis or therapeutic purposes. So we're talking about apps on phones. There was a lot of pressure not to include apps as medical devices, but I think it's fair that they are included in the regulation. There is increased transparency for users and competent authorities across Europe, so the introduction of a more detailed EUDAMED system and requirements for periodic safety update reports and summary of safety and performance reports. So the establishment of this database to include this information, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later. There's the same for the IVDR as well. There are increased information for patients and users. So if you have an implantable device going forward, this will come with an implant card that will give you details of the device name and the lot number, and some details on what you might expect from the performance of the device and the lifetime of your device, which I think is beneficial. There are many changes, but a lot of them manufacturers are doing already and have control over. There's some things that we don't have control over. Those are the implementing and delegating acts, the harmonized standards and the timelines for ensuring that they will apply under the MDR, and sometimes the classification or the details of the classification we don't have control of. Chapter 2 starts to talk about an expansion, so there's much more detail in Safety Performance Requirement 10 in terms of chemical, physical, and biological information. It's really a large expansion of Essential Requirement 7 to focus on those devices that are carcinogenic, mutagenic, and toxic to reproduction, and those requirements. And it also removes reference to the medicinal consultation procedure because that's elsewhere in the regulation. There are more requirements for infection and microbial contamination in SPR 11. The medicinal substances scope is expanded into its own SPR at number 12 and includes those products that are locally absorbed, so those ones that we talked about being ingested potentially. It also expands the information on biological tissues to include the human tissues as well as the animal tissue information. So there's a whole requirement for those. And then it expands the requirements for environmental compatibility with other devices, ergonomics, calibration, disposal. I think disposal is often forgotten under the MDD and how you get rid of your device. Requirements in terms of SPR 16 to 18, but it really adds the requirements for the active implantable directive into the requirements for the active devices in the current directive. So it's about bringing those things together, but it gives a lot more emphasis to the requirements for 60601 and starts to copy words from 60601 into the regulation to make it more specific. And under SPR 20, there's just a lot more detail on mechanical and thermal risks and the mitigation of fitting and refitting of parts. In terms of number 22, there is a new requirement, and this relates to devices intended to be used for laypersons. So in the past, the essential requirements talked about ensuring that the information was available and that they were ergonomically appropriate to use for intended users. It never talked specifically about laypersons, but if you think about a condom, they're used by everyone. Not everyone can read. The information and the requirements for use need to be catered for a larger range of people, not just a surgeon. A lot of the devices that my team work with are intended specifically for surgeons and would never be let loose with a layperson. But it adds that requirement and makes manufacturers think about it and address it more clearly. In Chapter 3, this is a large expansion on what's required in terms of information for use. The labeling requirements, we talked about UDI, there's a lot more information on labeling and what's required. There's also a lot more information on the general requirements. Is it readable? Can it be understood by the user? If I'm honest, if it's an orthopedic surgeon, I think they throw them in the bin, so I'm not sure it makes any difference under the MDR or the MDD, but how can you make it understood, and what are the residual risks, and how are you informing of those residual risks? It also has many implications on the specific requirements in terms of animal tissues or human tissues and UDI and medicines. And specific requirements for labeling, I think historically medical device manufacturers haven't labeled carcinogenic, mutagenic, toxic for reproduction devices, but going forward there are now harmonized standards that recognize specific labels that can be used, and those now need to be addressed because they're identified in the MDR. There are new requirements for instructions for use and cross-referencing for other things such as installation, instructions for installation, instructions for use, instructions specifically for those devices that are absorbable or dispersible, what's acceptable absorption, any security measures that need to be taken for those software devices or active devices. So it's a significant increase in the requirements. So if I move on to the technical documentation, obviously the instructions for use are part of your technical documentation. The essential requirements or summary of safety and performance are part of your technical documentation. Overall, there are other aspects. There are some subtle differences between the MDD and the MDR. The MDD is a directive that each country has to put into their own national law, whereas the MDR is European law at the point of application. So once it's gone, it's law, and European countries don't have to apply it. So it should be applied more consistently across Europe. You need a QMS audit, you need a technical documentation review, and you need probably a micro or sterilization review if you've got a sterile device. And then you get your certificates. And in terms of a QMS certificate, it's going to look quite different from those certificates that you currently hold. There's going to be a lot more detail. Many of the certificates will have to list specific devices on the certificates, and there will be a lot more information. In terms of product certificates, again, a lot more information on the specific product codes covered, the UDI, and other information will be on there. For larger manufacturers, when you transition, it will probably be an approach that you start off with a QMS certificate that has a limited scope, and you start to extend that scope for each of the devices as you do technical documentation reviews. So it's not going to be possible to just bulk change everything over. It's going to be a transition, and notified bodies will work with you to ensure that that transition is completed as required before certificates expire under the MDD.